In the depths of the Xenobiology Research Center on Mars Colony 7, Dr. Sarah Chen stared at her holoscreen in disbelief. The genetic analysis she'd been running for the past 6 hours revealed something impossible, something that would change humanity's relationship with the stars forever. The Valoran genetic samples were degrading. Not just degrading. They were collapsing at a fundamental level. Sarah pushed away from her desk, the low Martian gravity making the movement more dramatic than intended. The red planet's afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dome's reinforced windows, painting her lab in shades of rust and gold. She needed to be absolutely certain before making this call. HFY, run the analysis again. Full spectrum, quantum-level resolution. She commanded the lab's AI system. Initiating analysis. Estimated completion time. 3 hours, 17 minutes. HFY responded in its characteristic calm tone. Sarah paced the lab, her footsteps echoing off the sterile walls. The Valorans were among the most advanced species humanity had encountered since achieving faster-than-light travel 30 years ago. Their biosynthetic technology had revolutionized human medicine. Their quantum computers had accelerated human scientific understanding by decades, and their guidance had helped humanity avoid several potential diplomatic disasters with other spacefaring races. And now they were dying. The initial samples had arrived through official channels, part of a routine exchange of scientific data. But Sarah had noticed anomalies that others had missed. Subtle patterns in the Valoran genetic structure that shouldn't have been there. Patterns that reminded her of her doctoral work on terrestrial genetic collapse scenarios. The holoscreen chimed. Sarah spun around, surprised. HFY. That's nowhere near 3 hours. Analysis terminated early. Pattern match found in historical database. Displaying results. The screen filled with a comparison she'd seen before, but hadn't dared believe. The Valoran genetic degradation matched exactly with the collapse patterns she documented in her thesis work on Earth's 6th extinction event. The same cascading breakdown of genetic stability, the same failure of cellular repair mechanisms. But this was happening on a species-wide scale. Sarah's hands trembled as she initiated a priority communication to the Human Valoran Scientific Exchange Council. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. This was potentially the end of a civilization. The response came faster than she expected. Instead of the usual bureaucratic acknowledgement, her holoscreen filled with the image of first speaker Lyra, the highest-ranking Valoran in the Exchange Council. The alien's bioluminescent markings pulsed with colors Sarah had never seen before. Dr. Chen, the first speaker's translated voice carried unusual urgency. Your findings have been anticipated. We request your immediate presence on Velora Prime. Sarah blinked. I'm sorry. What do you mean, anticipated? We have been aware of the degradation for approximately one of your Earth decades. Our best minds have failed to find a solution. Your work on genetic collapse scenarios. It offers a perspective we lack. The implications hit Sarah like a gravity wave. You've known. Why haven't you? Political considerations, Lyra interrupted, her markings shifting to deeper hues. Our society is complex. Change does not come easily to us. But we are running out of time. Will you come? Sarah looked around her lab, at the years of research displayed on its walls, at the comfortable predictability of her life on Mars. Then she looked back at the genetic analysis still floating on her screen, at the evidence of a dying civilization asking for help. When do we leave? The journey to Velora Prime took 3 weeks in fold space. Sarah spent most of it studying everything humanity knew about Valoran biology, which wasn't nearly enough. The Valorans had always been private about their physiological makeup, and now Sarah understood why. Her quarters aboard the Valoran ship Dawning Light were clearly designed with human comfort in mind, but they couldn't hide the ship's alien nature. The walls pulsed with living light, the air carried strange harmonics that made her teeth ache, and every surface seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at it. On the final day of the journey, first speaker Lyra visited her quarters. The Valoran's tall, elegant form seemed to fill the room with subtle light. "We will arrive soon," Lyra said. "There is something you should understand before we land. Your presence on our world is unprecedented. Some will resist your help simply because you are human. Others will resist because they believe the degradation is natural, a sign from the universe that our time has passed." "And what do you believe?" Sarah asked. Lyra's markings rippled with what Sarah had learned to recognize as amusement. "I believe that the universe is vast and complex, and that sometimes the answers we seek come from unexpected places. I believe that your species' greatest strength is your ability to see problems differently than we do. Our greatest strength is usually considered to be our stubbornness," Sarah said with a small smile. "Perhaps they are the same thing." Lyra moved to leave, then paused. "Dr. Chen, there is one more thing. The degradation. It is accelerating. Our most recent projections give us less than 5 years before genetic collapse becomes irreversible. Whatever you discover on our world, whatever you decide to do, time is not our ally." As Lyra left, Sarah turned to look out the viewport at the approaching planet. Velara Prime hung in space like a jewel, its atmosphere shimmering with colors that Earth's sky had never known. Somewhere on that alien world was the answer to saving an entire species. She just had to find it before time ran out. The ship descended through layers of iridescent clouds, and Sarah felt the weight of history settling onto her shoulders. Humanity's first contact with the Valerans had changed everything. Now this second contact might determine whether their new allies had a future at all. As the ship's landing sequence began, Sarah Chen, xenobiologist from Mars, prepared to step into a mystery that would either save a civilization or witness its end. Every cell in her body told her this was bigger than she was ready for, but history rarely waited for anyone to be ready. Velara Prime's capital city defied everything Sarah had expected. Instead of the sleek, technological metropolis common to advanced civilizations, she found herself in a living artwork. Buildings grew rather than stood, their crystalline structures shifting subtly in ways that made her human brain struggle to process. The air itself seemed alive with tiny motes of light that responded to movement and emotion. The Valoran High Council chamber epitomized this organic architecture. Sweeping arches of living crystal curved overhead, their transparency revealing the alien sky beyond. But Sarah barely noticed the architecture now. Her attention was fixed on the genetic data floating in the chamber's central holographic display. "Impossible," declared Council Elder Ven, his bioluminescent patterns flashing with skepticism. "What you propose goes against every principle of our evolutionary understanding." Sarah fought to keep her frustration in check. She'd been on Velara Prime for 3 weeks, and every day had been a battle against not just scientific challenges, but cultural ones as well. "With respect, Elder," she said, choosing her words carefully, "your evolutionary understanding is exactly what's killing you." A ripple of color change passed through the assembled council members. First Speaker Lyra, standing beside Sarah, gave a subtle signal of support. "The genetic degradation isn't a disease or an attack," Sarah continued, manipulating the holographic display. "It's a natural response to artificial stagnation. Your society's dedication to genetic purity, to maintaining what you call perfect forms, has eliminated your species' ability to adapt." She highlighted a sequence in the display, expanding it to show the complex molecular structures. "These markers show signs of engineered stability, introduced somewhere in your distant past. They were probably meant to protect against mutation, to preserve desired traits. But they've become too perfect, too rigid. Your DNA can't respond to natural environmental pressures anymore." Elder Ven's markings darkened to deep indigo, a sign of dismissal Sarah had come to know well. "You suggest we should deliberately introduce imperfection into our genetic legacy. This is precisely why bringing in an outsider was a mistake." "I suggest," Sarah countered, her voice firm, "that perfection without adaptation is just another word for extinction." The chamber fell silent. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of alien gazes upon her. In the 3 weeks she'd been here, she'd learned that the Valorans' greatest strength, their cultural unity and stability, was also their greatest weakness. They had engineered their entire society, down to the molecular level, to resist change. First speaker Lyra stepped forward, her patterns showing diplomatic neutrality. Dr. Chen has provided evidence that her theory is correct. The degradation patterns match historical records from Earth's mass extinction events. The difference is that humanity's ancestors survived those events through adaptation. Our ancestors. She paused, her colors shifting to something Sarah hadn't seen before. Our ancestors chose a different path. And that path served us well for millennia. Another council member interjected. Our stability gave us the peace to advance beyond primitive conflict, to reach the stars. And now it's killing you, Sarah said quietly. The holographic display shifted again, showing projection models. At current rates of degradation, cellular repair mechanisms will fail completely within 4 years. The effects will cascade through your population. First, fertility rates will drop, then life expectancy. Within a generation, the Valoran species will be functionally extinct. She took a deep breath, knowing her next words would be controversial. But there's hope. My research shows that the damage can be reversed, but it requires something radical. We need to reactivate your species' dormant adaptation mechanisms, not just at a genetic level, but at a cultural one as well. The chamber erupted in debate, patterns of light flashing between council members in their native communication method. Sarah couldn't follow all of it, but she could feel the tension building. Elder Ven's voice cut through the chaos. And who would oversee this reactivation? You? A human scientist who has barely scratched the surface of our civilization's complexity. No, Sarah replied, surprising them with her certainty. You would. But you need an outsider's perspective to see the path. Sometimes it takes a different viewpoint to recognize when tradition has become a trap. First speaker Lyra moved to the center of the chamber, her presence commanding attention. Council members, consider this. Our ancestors engineered stability because they feared chaos. But in doing so, they may have engineered our extinction. Dr. Chen offers us a choice between controlled adaptation and inevitable end. A young council member Sarah hadn't heard speak before raised her voice. What if the human is right? What if our greatest strength has become our greatest weakness? Our history speaks of the first choice, when our ancestors chose stability over chaos. Perhaps it is time for a second choice. The debate raged for hours. Sarah stood her ground, explaining, demonstrating, arguing. But as the alien suns set outside the crystal dome, she could see that fear was winning over reason. The Valorans were facing a choice between certain death by their own principles or uncertain survival through change. As the session finally ended, first speaker Lyra approached Sarah privately. You've given them much to think about, Dr. Chen. Perhaps too much. Sarah nodded tiredly. They're afraid. I understand that. But fear of change can't be allowed to override the need for survival. Lyra's patterns shifted to a color Sarah had never seen her display before. There is something you should know. The Council's resistance. It is not merely about tradition. There are those who believe this genetic degradation is not natural at all, that it was engineered, a fail-safe built into our ancient modifications. Sarah felt her exhaustion vanish. A fail-safe. Why? To ensure that if we ever became too static, too unchanging, Lyra's patterns dulled to near darkness, we would be forced to either adapt or die. Our ancestors may have understood more than we gave them credit for. Sarah stared at the empty council chamber, her mind racing with new possibilities. Then we're not just fighting against time, she said slowly. We're fighting against your ancestors' own safeguards against stagnation. Yes, Lyra confirmed. And tomorrow, when you present your detailed treatment proposal to the council, remember this. You are not just offering us a cure. You are offering us the key to fulfilling our ancestors' true legacy. As Sarah left the chamber that night, the living lights of the city pulsed around her with unknown meanings. She had come to save a species, but she was beginning to realize that she might be part of something much bigger. The revival of not just a people's genes, but of their very capacity to grow and change. The weight of stars indeed, she thought, looking up at the alien sky. But perhaps that weight was meant to be shared. The explosion rocked Sarah's laboratory just before dawn. The blast shattered the crystalline walls, sending shards of living architecture raining down on her experimental samples. If she hadn't been working late, checking on her latest genetic trials, she would have been asleep in her quarters, exactly where the attackers had expected her to be. Dr. Chen. First speaker Lyra's voice came through the emergency communication system. Are you harmed? Sarah coughed, waving away the shimmer-like particles that filled the air. I'm fine, but 3 months of research. She looked at the destroyed sample containers, each one representing weeks of careful genetic manipulation. They knew exactly what they were targeting. Security forces are en route. Do not leave the laboratory. But Sarah was already moving, salvaging what she could from the wreckage. One sample container had survived, the most promising one, showing the first successful signs of controlled genetic reactivation. She carefully secured it in a portable stasis field. The security forces arrived moments later, led by Commander Vex, his combat-modified bioluminescence pulsing with aggressive patterns. The perpetrators were caught, he announced, his translator making his voice sound even grimmer than usual. They are members of the Eternal Path. Sarah had heard whispers about the Eternal Path, a radical faction that believed any change to Valoran genetics was blasphemy. Until now, they had limited themselves to political opposition. They're getting desperate, she said, checking the stasis field's integrity. Because we're getting close. First speaker Lyra arrived personally, her patterns showing concern tinged with anger. The council is convening an emergency session. This attack changes everything. The council chamber was chaos when they arrived. The normal orderly proceedings had given way to flashing patterns of agitation and fear. Elder Ven stood at the center, his markings pulsing with righteous fury. See what your human's presence has brought us, he thundered. Violence, discord, the very chaos our ancestors sought to eliminate. The chaos was already here, Sarah shot back, stepping forward with the surviving sample. You're just finally seeing it. Look at this. She activated a holoscreen, displaying the latest test results. The genetic reactivation process is working. We've successfully restored adaptive capabilities in controlled samples without triggering systemic collapse. At what cost? Elder Ven demanded. Our society stands on the brink of civil conflict. The Eternal Path speaks for many who fear what this change could bring. And what does your fear of change bring? Sarah challenged, her patience finally breaking. Tonight, your people tried to murder a diplomatic guest and destroy research that could save your species. Is that the stability you're so desperate to preserve? The chamber fell silent. Sarah realized she had violated about a dozen diplomatic protocols, but she couldn't bring herself to care. 3 months on this world had taught her that sometimes protocols needed to be broken. First speaker Lyra moved to stand beside her. Dr. Chen speaks harshly, but her words carry truth. We face 2 paths now, adaptation or extinction. The attack tonight shows that some would choose extinction not just for themselves, but for all of us. A younger council member, Sarah recognized her as Mira, one of the few who had supported her research from the beginning, stepped forward. There is something else we must consider. The degradation is accelerating faster than projected. The latest medical reports show cellular breakdown in our youngest generation has increased by 30%. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Show me the data. The holographic displays filled with new information, and Sarah's heart sank. The genetic collapse wasn't just accelerating. It was adapting to their attempts to stop it. Almost as if, it's responding, she whispered. Then louder, it's responding. Don't you see? The failsafe isn't just degrading your genetics, it's actively fighting our attempts to stop it. Your ancestors didn't just build in a safeguard against stagnation. They created a system that would force adaptation or ensure complete collapse. The council chamber erupted again. But this time, the patterns were different. Fear mixed with something else. Understanding, perhaps, or hope. Commander Vex, who had remained silent until now, spoke. If what you say is true, then we are not just fighting time. We are fighting our own legacy. No, Sarah said, moving to the center of the chamber. We're fulfilling it. Your ancestors didn't want you to die. They wanted you to remember how to live, to change, to grow. She held up the surviving sample. This isn't just about genetic modification anymore. It's about choosing to be more than what you've become. First speaker Lyra's patterns shifted to colors Sarah had never seen before. Deep, complex harmonies that seemed to resonate with the chamber itself. Then perhaps it is time for the second choice. Not between stability and chaos, but between stagnation and growth. Elder Ven's opposition seemed to waver for the first time. And if we make this choice, if we follow your path, what becomes of all we have built? It grows, Sarah said simply. It changes. It becomes more than what it was. Isn't that what every parent wants for their child? What every civilization wants for its future? The debate raged through the night, but something had shifted. The attack had forced the issue into the open, had made the abstract threat of extinction viscerally real. By dawn, the council had reached a decision. We will proceed with full implementation. First speaker Lyra announced. All resources will be made available. But Dr. Chen, she turned to Sarah, her pattern serious. You must understand what this means. Once we begin, there is no going back. Our society, our very biology, will never be the same. Sarah looked at the sample in her hands. The key to saving a civilization, if only they were brave enough to use it. Sometimes, she said, the only way forward is to leave the past behind. As the alien suns rose over the living city, casting rainbow light through the crystal towers, Sarah Chen prepared for the hardest part of her mission. She had convinced them to change. Now she had to help them survive it. The breaking point had come. What would emerge on the other side remained to be seen. The transformation began in the heart of spring. Sarah watched from her newly rebuilt laboratory as the first wave of volunteers received the genetic reactivation treatment. The process was beautiful in its way. Each recipient's bioluminescent patterns shifting through previously impossible colors as their ancient genetic locks were finally released. But beauty had a price. The pain is unexpected. First speaker Lyra admitted, her own patterns flickering erratically as her body adjusted to the changes. As the highest-ranking supporter of the project, she had insisted on being among the first recipients. Our people are not accustomed to such sensations. Sarah monitored the readings carefully. Pain is part of adaptation, she said softly. Your ancestors engineered it out of your species along with so many other survival mechanisms. Bringing them back means accepting everything that comes with them. The medical ward filled with more patients each day. The young came first, their bodies more resilient to the changes. Then the scientists and progressives who had supported the project from the beginning. Even a few former opponents, including some reformed members of the Eternal Path, eventually joined the crew. But not everyone embraced the change. Abomination. The cry came from a crowd gathered outside the medical center. Elder Van stood at their head, his patterns burning with the harsh, fixed colors of the traditionalists. You corrupt our very essence with human science. Security forces maintained a barrier between the protesters and the medical center, but their presence was a constant reminder of how deeply the treatment had divided Valoran society. In her laboratory, Sarah made a breakthrough that changed everything. Look at this, she told Lyra, displaying a complex molecular scan. The adaptive sequences we've reactivated, they're not just changing your DNA. They're creating new types of quantum entanglement between cells. Lyra studied the display, her newly volatile patterns showing intense interest. Explain. Your species' bioluminescence isn't just communication. It's a quantum network linking all Valerans together. When your ancestors engineered stability, they didn't just lock down your genetics. They suppressed an entire layer of quantum biology that we're only beginning to understand. The implications were staggering. As more Valerans underwent the treatment, new patterns of communication emerged. The transformed began to share not just thoughts and emotions, but actual biological innovations. Each adaptation, each successful mutation, could be shared across the quantum network. But there was a catch. The network is rejecting those who haven't undergone the treatment, Sarah explained to an emergency council session. The quantum divergence between modified and unmodified Valerans is growing. Soon, they won't be able to communicate at all. The council chamber erupted in patterns of alarm. The ability to share thoughts and emotions through bioluminescence was the foundation of Valoran society. The idea of a permanent split was unthinkable. Elder Ven, one of the few council members who had refused the treatment, rose to speak. His pattern seemed dimmer now, harder for the transformed to perceive. You see, this human's cure is worse than the disease. It will divide our people forever. We are already divided, Mira countered, her new patterns rippling with previously impossible complexities. Between those who choose life with change and those who choose death with stability. The debate was interrupted by an urgent message from the medical center. Sarah felt her heart stop as she read the data. The failsafe, she whispered. It's mutating. The genetic collapse had accelerated again, but now it targeted the untransformed with terrifying precision. Those who had refused the treatment were beginning to show signs of rapid degradation. How long? First speaker Lyra asked, her patterns grave. Weeks, maybe days, Sarah replied. The failsafe isn't just pushing for adaptation anymore. It's eliminating those who refuse to change. The news spread through the quantum network like wildfire, causing a surge of new volunteers for the treatment. But for many of the traditionalists, the choice remained impossible. Elder Ven surprised everyone by coming to Sarah's laboratory late that night. His patterns were noticeably faded. You feel it, don't you? Sarah asked gently. The degradation. Yes, his patterns flickered with what might have been fear. But I came to show you something. He produced an ancient data crystal. This was passed down through my lineage, unopened, with instructions to use it only in our species' darkest hour. The crystal contained a message that changed everything. A quantum-encoded transmission from the original genetic engineers who had created the Valoran stability protocols. We created perfection, the ancient message said, but we came to understand that perfection is death. True life requires change, growth, even pain. The failsafe is not a punishment, but a gift, a way back to the path of evolution. When it activates, know that the time has come to remember what it means to be alive. Sarah watched Elder Ven's patterns as he absorbed his ancestors' words. They knew, he said finally. All this time, they knew this day would come. Will you take the treatment? Sarah asked. His patterns shifted to a color she had never seen before, something between acceptance and fear. I will. Not for myself, but for the future our ancestors truly wanted for us. The next few days were a blur of activity. As word of the ancient message spread, the last resistance to the treatment crumbled. Sarah worked tirelessly, refining the process, helping the transformed understand their new capabilities. But late one night, monitoring the quantum network, she discovered something unexpected. The transformed Valerans weren't just sharing biological innovations. They were beginning to share something deeper. Dreams, hopes, possibilities that had been locked away for millennia. And in those shared visions, she saw something that took her breath away. A future where humanity and Valerans might share more than just technology and trade. A future where two species might learn from each other's strengths and overcome their weaknesses together. The transformation was far from complete, but as Sarah watched the quantum network pulse with new life, She knew that something extraordinary was happening. The Valorans weren't just surviving. They were becoming something new, something that combined the best of what they had been with the potential of what they could become. The price of change was high, but the reward was nothing less than rebirth. 6 months after the first treatment, Sarah stood in the transformed heart of Valora Prime's capital city. The crystalline structures that had once been rigid and unchanging now flowed with organic grace, responding to the quantum network that connected their transformed inhabitants. The air itself seemed more alive, shimmering with complex patterns of communication that her human eyes could only partially perceive. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" First speaker Lyra asked, joining her on the observation platform. Her patterns had evolved far beyond their original capabilities, showing colors that had no names in any human language. "Though I suspect you see it differently than we do." "I see enough," Sarah replied, watching the city pulse with life. "How are the final transformations progressing?" "The last group completed their transition yesterday. Even the most resistant have adapted now." Lyra's patterns shifted to something contemplative. Though perhaps adapted is too simple a word for what we've become. She was right. The Valoran species had done more than just survive their genetic crisis. They had transcended it. The reactivated quantum networks had unlocked potential that had lain dormant for millennia. They were no longer just a civilization of perfect stability, but one of constant, controlled evolution. The changes had rippled through every aspect of their society. Their technology, once focused on maintaining unchanging patterns, now grew and evolved alongside them. Their art, their music, their very way of thinking had been transformed by the restored ability to adapt and change. "The Council has reached a decision," Lyra said, her patterns showing complex harmonies of anticipation. "We want to establish a permanent genetic research exchange with Earth, not just to study what happened here, but to explore the possibilities of quantum biology in humans." Sarah turned to her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Your species has something we had forgotten, an innate drive to adapt and change. But our quantum networks, our ability to share biological innovations, imagine if we could find a way to merge these strengths." The implications were staggering. "Are you suggesting some kind of human-Valoran hybrid research?" "We're suggesting evolution itself might be ready for a new chapter." Lyra's patterns rippled with excitement. "Our scientists have discovered that the quantum principles underlying our networks exist in all living things. They're just expressed differently. In humans, they manifest as what you call intuition, empathy, the inexplicable connections between twins." "The ghost in the machine," Sarah whispered, remembering an old professor's words. "We've always known there was something more to consciousness than just biochemistry." A commotion near the city center drew their attention. A group of young Valorans was experimenting with their new abilities, their patterns creating synchronized waves of light that transformed the architecture around them. What had once been seen as dangerous chaos was now recognized as necessary creativity. "There are challenges ahead," Lyra admitted. "Some fear we've gone too far, too fast. The quantum network grows more complex each day, developing in ways we hadn't anticipated. And there are questions about how much change is too much, where we should draw the line between adaptation and losing ourselves entirely." Sarah watched a crystal spire reshape itself in response to the quantum signals it received. "Change doesn't mean losing yourself," she said. "It means becoming more of what you truly are." A message flashed through the quantum network, visible to Sarah through her enhanced sensor suite. The first Valoran ships modified with the new quantum adaptive technology were ready for their maiden voyage. They would carry ambassadors to Earth, bearing proposals for joint research projects that would reshape both their civilizations. "You know," Sarah said, "when I first came here, I thought I was just dealing with a genetic problem. I never imagined that you would help birth a new era for both our species." Lyra's patterns showed what Sarah had learned to recognize as amusement. The best discoveries often come from unexpected places. It's a lesson we had to relearn. As the alien sun set, Casting rainbow light through the quantum responsive architecture, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A human scientist, called to save an alien species, had instead helped them remember who they truly were, and in doing so, had opened doors to possibilities that neither humanity nor the Valorans had imagined possible. The next morning, Sarah would board a ship back to Earth. She carried with her not just research data and diplomatic agreements, but something more precious: the knowledge that change, however frightening, held the seeds of transformation. That adaptation wasn't just about survival, but about becoming something greater than what came before. As she looked out over the living city one last time, she saw not just what the Valorans had become, but what humanity might one day be. Two species, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, reaching across the gulf of space to help each other evolve. The stars themselves seemed to pulse with possibility. "Ready to go?" Lyra asked, her patterns showing the complex emotions of farewell. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of future history in the moment. "Ready, though I have a feeling this isn't an ending." "No," Lyra agreed, her patterns shifting to something new, something that spoke of horizons yet to come. "It's barely even a beginning." Above them, the quantum network pulsed with the combined dreams of a transformed civilization, reaching out to touch the future that awaited both their worlds. In the end, the greatest triumph hadn't been merely surviving extinction. It had been learning that the deepest strength comes not from resisting change, but from embracing it together. The journey ahead was uncertain, full of challenges neither species could predict, but they would face it as they had faced the crisis that brought them together, with courage, curiosity, and the unshakable belief that the greatest adventures lay not in preserving what was, but in discovering what could be.